On our way from Dryden with John and Marion Hindman, we paused momentarily at the Central Standard Time Zone for Canada. At this junction, all the streams and rivers to the north flowed out into the Arctic Ocean. But we were headed south, and our first stop along the way was Kakabeka Falls. Kakabeka Falls, although only small in comparison to Niagara Falls, was just as spectacular as we viewed it from our vantage point on the edge of the cliff. These natural falls became the main source of the hydroelectricity for Thunder Bay and the surrounding area in the early part of the century. Through a gap in the foliage, we got a glimpse of the river far below the falls. As we gazed at the water below the falls, we saw the river flowing silently along the valley floor, encased in a sea of green as the trees on either side extended as far away as the human eye could see. Water from the falls is now linked into supply lines from across the country. Just a few miles short of Thunder Bay, we came to the reconstructed trading post of Old Fort William. The original Old Fort William was a fur trading post and belonged to the North West Company of 1815. Furs from the north and west were transported from here to Montreal by canoe. The main gate and the 10-foot high wooden palisade were well fortified with some very sharp spikes. Passing through the gate, we found ourselves on a large grass rectangle with gravel paths crisscrossing the area in the shape of the Union Jack. Directly ahead, the large white building was the Great White Hall, with its impressive dining hall and social centre. To the right of the Great Hall was the Bell House, which was the summer residence for senior clerks. Around the perimeter of the rectangle were many other fine buildings of log cabin construction. Entering the living quarters, we were able to admire some of the beautiful old period furniture, which had been carefully preserved over the years. The lookout tower and observatory stood in the southeast corner of the old fort. Originally, the fort was named Fort Kaministiquia and was situated on Lake Superior. In the late 1700s, the North West Company of Montreal made its mark on the North American fur trade, and Fort William became the crucial link in its success, facilitating the transshipment of furs from the west and trade goods from the east. We found our way over to the canoe shed, where many of the great canoes were freely displayed. One canoe was over 36 feet in length, and most seemed to be covered with hides and skins. Our guide took us to see a birch bark canoe in the process of being built.
How do you feel?
It's amazing how they could split that cedar so thin like that.
Isn't it? Dressed in the custom of the late 1700s, our guide gave us a detailed description of the articles used in the kitchen and a very interesting insight into the food of that day and its preparation.
Fire everywhere. You got huge ones there, small ones here, and you can pull coals out onto the hearth, and then put what we call a spider trivet on top of a bed of coals. And, this is wild rice. This is a staple that's used in the West, and it's very high in carbohydrate value. It's very difficult to eat a lot of it, though. It's very filling. That's important.
A tour of the bakery next door immediately followed.
Well, so the kitchen, as you can see, this is a wall from the kitchen, and there's only one chimney for the hearth, the soup cauldrons, and the bake oven. The two large bake ovens that are here supply bread for the entire inhabitants. Come on, Mr. Payne. Cheers.
Outside the fort entrance, we came across an Indian display. Beaver skins were stretched out on frames to dry and were laced to the frames to prevent shrinking.
You used to soften them by chewing them.
For sewing like this, they cut them up and use them for threads.
Here we have a bear skin. A bear skin too was on display, and a number of Indian teepees were also set up around the area. It was now getting late in the afternoon as we moved on the final few miles to Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay is situated on the northwest shore of Lake Superior and is the main port through which most of the trade to the east coast is carried out. We drove up the small mountain behind the city to get an overall picture of the area. Dusk was fast approaching, so we made the most of the fading light to film what we could of the surroundings. Our attention was taken by a large lit-up cross at the mountaintop, which was visual for miles, erected presumably in memory of those who lost their lives on this great lake. Next morning we paid a visit to a grain elevator. Story has it that one night, years ago, this elevator rolled over, spilling all the grain into the lake. It is said that the seagulls were drunk around here for months. Grain seemed to be the main export from this port. Rail cars were in abundance, and huge grain elevators literally covered the skyline. We were taken to see the rail cars unloading the grain. As each car was shunted over the grating between the rails, the grain was released from the underside of the car and then elevated to the top of the terminal. After watching this activity for some time, we were then given a guided tour of the grain elevator. Our first stop was the control room, where the grain is weighed, measured out, and continually tested for quality.
Yeah, you want to get that on film because you don't see him doing.
You don't see him working very often?
Who are you talking about? Yeah. Cars, but.
From the control centre we moved to the top floor of the elevator. We walked past a maze of ducts and equipment and were led outside onto the landing, where we were able to get a splendid view across the bay. On looking over the side, we could see a ship alongside of the elevator, loading grain into one of the front holds. We learnt that the name of this vessel was the Canadian Ranger. We made our way back inside the elevator and then out onto the deck of the ship. From here we got a great view of the side of the elevator, showing the tubes used to load the ship. The first mate took us into the bridge and was quite eager to explain the methods of navigating the ship through the lake and the locks. Fortunately, the loading had ceased momentarily, so the dust was not too thick. Nevertheless, I covered my camera when out on deck.
Instrument. We cannot see outside. We are like blind people.
John's daughter Sharon had booked a cruise for us on the lake that afternoon, and it being a sunny day was quite enjoyable. This is the boat trip going on. We set off toward the east of the shoreline, passing many buildings in the area. Coming past the first grain elevator, we could see that lumber also took up a large portion of the trade carried on in this port. Seaplanes are also a common sight in and around Canada. This colourful elevator, we were told, had the capacity to store 7,750,000 bushels of grain. It is owned by the Richardson family from Winnipeg, Manitoba. We continued on past the numerous grain elevators that stood out starkly on the shoreline. Thunder Bay is the main shipping port for the grain from the western prairies to the eastern cities, and from there to Europe and points east. Lake freighters are long and narrow. This one was built in 1966, is 730 feet long and 75 feet wide. She is as long as a football field. This red boat, we were told, was built in 1972 and at the moment was having a $6 million refit. This old tug, built in 1905, has now been turned into a restaurant. The grain elevators seemed to be never-ending. It was obvious to our eyes that this seaport was a place of high activity and probably the most important port commercially on Lake Superior. The two largest employers in the port are the paper mills and the grain elevators. We passed Northern Wood Preservers establishment, which took up a large portion of the shoreline. Back behind their wharf, we saw huge piles of logs waiting to be treated. We came up to the Canadian Ranger, which we had been on that morning. The Canadian Ranger is actually made up of two broken ships. The bow was originally a Canadian vessel called the Elder Margine, and the stern was a German vessel called the Shimo. As we passed along the ship's side, the joint was clearly seen close to the stern. More elevators were to be seen as we continued on along this shoreline. We then passed a steel fabricating plant. Thunder Bay was originally two cities, Fort William on the south and Port Arthur on the north, originally known as Arthur's Landing. They were merged in 1970. In 1962, the city centres were 7 miles apart, and except for on the waterfront of Lake Superior, there were very few buildings for about 1 to 1.5 miles between the two.
And the train at the bottom?
As we continued upstream, we approached a giant railway and road bridge, which had to be opened for our passage through. The blast of the ferry's horn signalled our intention to do so. We were now in what seemed to be the old area of the port, and the ferry turned back towards the dock after reaching this deserted elevator. Once more we passed under the rail and road bridge. Note the huge counterweight helping to lift the bridge into the open position. On arriving at the dock, we were taken to John and Marion's daughter's house, which was a typical three-storey home in Thunder Bay. Many houses in Canada have a basement below the ground floor. This helps in the insulation of the house during the cold winter months. It was here we were introduced to John and Marion's granddaughters, Bonnie and Nikki.
Okay, my name is Bonita Lynn Blanco. I'm 18 years old.
It's like a dating game. And I like to ride horses.
Eligible bachelors in Australia. My phone number is 803-344-2350. I'm in second year photography at the college. No, it's not. 344. I think I know my phone number. And I'm Canadian. So hi.
And you are the daughter of?
Sharon Blanco. And I'm
John's sister.
which is John's sister, and I'm Marion Hyman's favorite granddaughter.
She's just a little conceited now.
And that's about it. I live in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Anything else?
That's fine.
Okay, my name is Nikki Blanco. I'm the daughter of Sharon, and I was told to say I'm also Marion Hyman's favorite granddaughter. And John Hyman is my uncle. I just registered for university, so now you are looking at a freshly registered, full-blooded university student who's going to be poor the rest of her life. Thank you.
Don't just.
Show them your broken tooth.
No, I don't show my broken tooth. I'm Sharon, John's sister, youngest sister. And I'm their mother.
And she's 40.
And she's single.
Thanks, guys.
We left Thunder Bay as the sun was coming up over the lake, and looking back saw a section of headland known as the Sleeping Giant. We stopped again to admire this autumn scenery at Gulch Creek Gorge, about an hour from Thunder Bay, and in the Quemoy Canyon. This was the last we saw of the Thunder Bay area, as we were now headed on a full day's journey to St. Joseph's Island, situated at the eastern end of Lake Superior.